After months of fighting, the House finally took a vote to release the files. And it turns out that a lot of Republicans were in favor of releasing the files.
Nays are 427, the nays are 1.
Who knew? Well, definitely not the Republicans. Meanwhile, Epstein's surviving victims kept the pressure on Trump.
And to the president, I want to send a clear message to you. While I do understand that your position has changed on the Epstein files, and I'm grateful that you have pledged to sign this bill, I can't help to be skeptical of what the agenda is.
In the end, faced with no other option, even Trump had to concede that the files should be released. So what was the one weird trick that finally forced the House to do the right thing? Why is everyone now suddenly an expert on congressional discharge petitions? And what happens now? Will we actually ever see any files? Now, candidate Trump said he would release these so-called Epstein files.
Would you declassify the Epstein files?
Yeah, I would.
Once he took office, though, Trump changed his tune, claiming that there's nothing to see here. It's all a hoax created by the Democrats.
So this is a Democrat hoax that never ends.
And in July, after claiming that the files were on Attorney General Pam Bondi's desk, Trump's Justice Department announced that there was no Epstein client list and that no more files would be released. Trump claimed the entire Epstein issue was boring and told everyone to just move on.
It's pretty boring stuff. It's sordid, but it's boring. And I don't understand why it keeps going.
And Trump claimed that he wasn't a fan of Epstein and that he hadn't spoken to Epstein for a decade and a half. Yet Trump was weirdly furious at the idea that any more Epstein files might get released. When the Wall Street Journal ran a story about Trump's creepy message in Epstein's 2003 birthday book, Trump sued the publication for $10 billion. In a lawsuit that's likely to get him sanctioned before he recovers $1, let alone $10 billion. And it seemed when anyone, including Trump's former supporters, called for the disclosure of the documents, he lashed out at them. But since it was clear that the administration wasn't going to release the files on its own, Representatives Ro Khanna, a Democrat from California, and Representative Thomas Massie, a Republican from Kentucky, introduced the Epstein Files Transparency Act. In response, Trump personally attacked Massie on social media, calling him, quote, a real loser, and proclaiming that he was looking for someone to run against Massie in his primary. Khanna and Massie's bill would require the Department of Justice to release the vast tranche of files within 30 days, with almost no exceptions. This includes files on Epstein and Maxwell, flight logs and travel records, Epstein's associates and co-conspirators, immunity deals or plea bargains he was offered, government communications about Epstein and the accusations against him, and records related to Epstein's death. The Epstein Files Transparency Act also specifically says that no files can be withheld just because they would be embarrassing to government officials, public figures, or foreign dignitaries, which is probably making a lot of people really nervous right now. The only things that could be withheld were details that would identify the victims, child sexual abuse materials, classified information, images depicting death or physical abuse, and documents that would jeopardize an active federal investigation or ongoing prosecution. Hang on to that because we're going to come back to it later. But given Trump's very public opposition to releasing the Epstein files, it was pretty obvious that Khanna and Massie's bill wasn't going to progress the usual way. So Khanna tried another method, attaching an amendment to another piece of legislation. When Republicans defeated this, Khanna and Massie came up with a new plan. They would employ a rarely used procedural mechanism, one weird trick if you will, to force the disclosure of the Epstein files. But all this talk of secret government documents reminds me it's probably a good time to wipe all your personal and private information off the internet. Your cell phone number, home address, email address, private social media accounts, and tons of sensitive data are shockingly easy to purchase by anybody online. But you can fight back and take control of your private information by signing up for today's sponsor, Incogni. Because Incogni wipes your personal data from the internet by searching the internet, reaching out to data brokers and websites directly on your behalf, and forcing them to remove your private information. If they resist, Incogni will take care of that too because Incogni fights back. But what makes Incogni truly powerful in taking back control of your privacy is the custom removals feature. It allows you to flag an unlimited number of sites where your data is exposed, and you can even have Incogni's privacy experts review and tackle the most uncooperative data brokers and people search sites. Now, I've been using Incogni for years now, and in that time you can see I've been on hundreds of lists, some of which had a high sensitivity score, meaning the broker had tons of data on me. Luckily, Incogni has completed hundreds of takedowns in that time. I could never do this myself, so thank you to Incogni for weeks worth of work and adding me to over 40 suppression lists. And Incogni will continue to conduct ongoing removals because even if the broker removes your data once, they can always collect it and publish it again. So if online privacy is important to you, give Incogni a try. If you scan the code on screen or click on the link in the description, you'll get 60% off their annual unlimited plan. Or try Incogni risk-free for 30 days. If you decide you want to keep it, you'll still get the 60% off discount so long as you use my code LegalEagle, all one word, at checkout. So sign up for Incogni or I'll see you in court. Now, typically bills in Congress are introduced and then referred to the committee with subject matter jurisdiction. That committee may hold hearings, debate the bill, and then vote on whether to report it back to the full House. After a bill is reported, it's sent to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee recommends how the bill will be debated on the floor and whether amendments will be allowed. Then the Rules Committee reports a resolution that sets those terms. Now, the House considers this, and if the House adopts the resolution, this controls whether amendments can be offered and how long the debate can go on. Once the resolution governing debate is adopted, the House will follow those rules and the bill is considered on the floor under the terms established by the Rules Committee. Now, the Epstein Files Transparency Act was referred to the Committee on the Judiciary, where it seemed destined to die a quiet death, like about 94% of bills, which die in committee. Massie and Khanna, though, came up with a plan to bypass Speaker Mike Johnson and the usual Rules Committee process and force a floor debate on the vote. Specifically, they decided to use what's called a discharge petition. Now, a discharge petition is a way for ordinary House members to get a bill considered on the floor, even if it hasn't passed out of committee. This procedural mechanism was originally created in 1910 as part of the revolt against the overpowered congressional leadership, which had made it very difficult for regular members to get their bills introduced. To move a discharge petition forward, the Congress members have to circulate a petition and get 218 House members, a majority, to sign. And discharge petitions are governed by House Rule 15, Clause 2. Now, there are two kinds of discharge petitions in the House. One can be used to force a vote on a bill, and the other can force a vote on a procedural rule. Now, discharging a bill normally requires waiting at least 30 legislative days after that bill has been sent to the committee, and Khanna and Massie didn't want to wait that long. So Representatives Khanna and Massey cleverly decided to create a discharge petition for a rule. They created a rule called House Resolution 581. The text of House Resolution 581 contained the instruction that, quote, immediately upon adoption of this resolution, the House shall proceed to the consideration in the House of the bill H.R. 185 to advance responsible policies. H.R. 185 was originally an unrelated bill, but once adopted, the rule would automatically replace the entire contents of H.R. 185 with the text of the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And by doing it this way, Khanna and Massey avoided the 30-day waiting period required for a discharging bill. And doing this also allowed Massey and Khanna to maintain control over the substance of the bill itself. House Resolution 581 explicitly waives all usual points of order except 1 hour of debate and 1 motion to recommit. Now, we're far into the weeds of congressional rulemaking, but if you're watching this channel, odds are you get off on this sort of thing. But if Khanna and Massey had used the discharge petition on the bill instead of using the discharge petition on this rule, that bill would be subject to all the usual congressional shenanigans. Other representatives could attach a dozen amendments to the bill, leadership could water it down or even gut it, defectors could require that, for example, there be a broad exemption for any material that might have national security implications. The list goes on. But by discharging a rule instead of a bill, on the other hand, they can essentially freeze the content of the bill, forcing an up or down vote on the text that Khanna and Massey drafted. And to move the discharge petition forward, though, they would need to get those 218 signatures. The Democrats were on board because once they figured out that the contents of the files seemed to be catastrophic for President Trump, they changed their tune and supported releasing those files. But at the time, there were only 213 of them. So they'd need some Republican support, which was going to be a challenge since lately the Republican Party is entirely subservient to Trump, who has made it clear that he would oppose any efforts to disclose the documents. Still, Congressperson Massey managed to get 3 other Republican representatives to sign his discharge petition. And that include Representatives Nancy Mace, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Lauren Boebert. So faced with these Republican defections and public pressure to hold a vote and release the Epstein files, Republican Speaker of the House Mike Johnson did the only thing he could do. He held a vote and released the files. No, I'm just kidding. Instead, Speaker Johnson shut the entire House down in early August during the government shutdown and kept it shut down for months on end. Johnson claimed he had many reasons for opposing the discharge petition. He was worried about the victims, the House Oversight Committee was already investigating, but his critics claimed that there was only one reason, that Trump opposed the disclosure of the documents and Johnson was doing his bidding. But when the House returned, Massey and Khanna were no less determined to move this forward. But they still needed one more vote.
And I think when we return in September, we'll get phase 2 of the Epstein files, because we'll get, I believe, every Democrat and at least a dozen Republicans who want transparency and justice.
Help was on the way, though, because in a September special election, Arizona elected Democratic Representative Adelita Grijalva to take the place of her father who passed away. So Khanna and Massey would have their 218th vote. Or they would have if Johnson had allowed her to be sworn in. Instead, Speaker Johnson deliberately slow-walked Representative Grijalva's swearing in for that entire time that the Congress was shut down. Johnson made all kinds of excuses for this delay. First, he said the election results needed to be certified, even though previous special election winners had been sworn in pretty much immediately. Then he claimed Grijalva couldn't be sworn in when Congress was in recess.
She won her election after the House was out of session.
When people pointed out that other representatives have, Johnson claimed that that was because they'd already flown their families and friends in to watch them be sworn in, and Representative Grijalva had not. And he argued that it just wouldn't be as fun for Representative Grijalva to be sworn in if the rest of the members weren't there. There would be no, quote, pomp and circumstance.
She deserves to have all the pomp and circumstance that everybody else does. She deserves to have a full House of members and go down and do the speech and have her family and friends in the balcony.
But Democrats claimed that the real reason for this delay was that Johnson didn't want Grijalva to be the 218th signature on the Epstein Files discharge petition. So more than a month and a half passed, and a lawsuit was filed on behalf of Grijalva, and Trump continued to try to block the release of the files. Some sources claim that Trump even pulled Representative Boebert into the Situation Room to try to get her to remove her signature from the discharge petition. But Boebert, Greene, and Mace refused to back down, and Representative Grijalva was finally sworn in on November 12th. And not surprisingly, Representative Grijalva immediately added her name to the discharge petition, finally giving Khanna and Massey their 218th signature. Now, under House Rule 15, Section 2C1, though, 7 more legislative days had to pass before one of the signatories can notify the House that they intend to offer the discharge petition. After that, Speaker Johnson would have 2 days to schedule the vote. And because his efforts to stymie Representative Grijalva's swearing in failed, and he was now staring down the inevitable discharge petition, Speaker Johnson was faced with an uncomfortable choice. He could either let Representatives Khanna and Massey's Rebel Alliance force the vote, or he could take the matters into his own hands, try to save some face, and schedule the vote himself. So he took the face-saving option and grudgingly promised to expedite the process and hold a vote on the Epstein Files Transparency Act this week. Johnson, though, still claimed that the discharge petition was reckless. And meanwhile, Trump continued to rail against the release of the documents. On Truth Social, the president declared that this was just the Democrats, quote, pushing the Epstein hoax again. For my own part, I'm fascinated as to which part of this he thinks is the hoax, but he criticized the, quote, weak Republicans who have fallen into their clutches because they are soft and foolish. And Trump escalated his attacks on Massey specifically, personally insulting Massey for recently remarrying after the June 2024 death of his first wife. And one of Trump's top political advisors called Massey garbage in a Twitter post. And that same political advisor worked to primary Massey in Kentucky. Trump also attacked Greene, declaring that he was withdrawing his support from her, that she was wacky and a lunatic, and she's a Republican in name only, and she's a traitor. Still, Massey and his 3 Republican signatories refused to back down. In an interview, Massey called Trump out for protecting pedophiles.
The deal for Republicans on this vote is that Trump will protect you if you vote the wrong way. In other words, if you vote to cover up for pedophiles, you've got cover in a Republican primary.
And meanwhile, as you probably saw, the Democrats released a portion of files which included emails between Epstein and several people discussing Trump's ties to Epstein and his potential knowledge about Epstein's pedophilia. And in retaliation, Trump told Attorney General Pam Bondi to launch a new investigation into only Democrats who were associated with Epstein. Now, unfortunately for Trump, public opinion is solidly in favor of releasing all the files. A September poll revealed that 77% of Americans want the administration to release the full Epstein files, and since Massey and Khanna got their 218 signatures, there was no way to stop the rain. So it seems on Sunday, November 16th, Trump abruptly shifted his position, suddenly declaring that the Republicans should vote for the Epstein files to be released. In a post, Trump proclaimed, quote, "I don't care, and House Republicans should vote to release the Epstein files because we have nothing to hide." And he posted an article on the White House website arguing that really the Democrats are the ones who are hiding the truth about the Epstein files. So Johnson, with no option left except to do the right thing, actually held a vote on Tuesday. Remarkably, the House voted to pass the bill 427-1, with only Representative Clay Higgins against. And then it went to the Senate. Now, victory in the Senate definitely wasn't guaranteed. Senate leaders hadn't committed to holding a vote, and even if the bill did get a vote, it could be subject to amendments that would effectively gut it. In fact, after a friendly chat with Majority Leader John Thune, Johnson reported that he was confident that Thune would stymie the bill.
I called my counterpart in the Senate, Leader Thune, and I talked him through this with him and shared our deep concerns. And of course, they share those concerns as well. And so I'm very confident that when this moves forward in the process, if and when it is processed in the Senate, which there's no certainty that that will be, that they will take the time methodically to do what we have not been allowed to do in the House.
But it seems that Thune rejected Johnson's claim. And again, remarkably, the Senate passed the bill by unanimous consent, and they deemed it passed. So it passed without amendment. So now it moves to President Trump's desk. Trump could theoretically veto the bill to prevent the disclosure of the Epstein files, but the margins are so high that even if Trump vetoes the bill, unless a whole bunch of votes change, Congress will override his veto. But that's not the end of the story. But there is yet one weird trick, because the Trump administration may still have an ace up its sleeve. Remember Pam Bondi's investigation? Well, by launching a new investigation, she may have thwarted the release of many of the documents. That's because Section 2 of the Epstein Files Transparency Act allows for the withholding of documents that would, quote, jeopardize an active federal investigation or ongoing prosecution. That BS investigation may not only stymie the release of documents under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, but also under the Freedom of Information Act. Because there are several ongoing lawsuits demanding the release of the files, but the Freedom of Information Act, like the Epstein Files Transparency Act, also contains a provision allowing for the withholding of records related to an active law enforcement investigation. So it's possible that even after all this trouble, the administration will argue that actually, according to the terms of the bill itself, it's allowed to still withhold the Epstein files because of this one weird trick, launching another bogus investigation against its political enemies. But it's not like the Trump administration has ever launched a bogus investigation into its political enemies, right? Massey and Khanna anticipated that Bondi would do an end run around the bill by reopening criminal investigations. But there are a few things to keep in mind here. Back in July, Bondi released a memo concluding that there was no Epstein client list and no credible information that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals as part of his actions. Though that's interesting given that some of the emails that were released have journalist Michael Wolff talking about blackmailing Trump using Epstein's information. But she also said, quote, "We did not uncover evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties." What changed? Well, only that Trump's former personal attorney and now second in command of the DOJ, Todd Blanche, interviewed Maxwell in prison, and Trump demanded investigations into his political enemies. So you should treat Bondi's assertion that they suddenly found some new evidence with extreme skepticism. And Massey and Khanna presume that Bondi will work overtime to redact and withhold as much as possible. So the bill tried to cover that prospect by requiring Bondi to provide a detailed report to Congress listing what she withheld. Quote, "All redactions must be accompanied by a written justification published in the Federal Register and submitted to Congress." And in the event that Bondi withholds information because it's classified, she has to, quote, "release an unclassified summary for each of the redacted or withheld classified information." And Bondi has 15 days from the report of redactions to submit a separate report to Congress. This report will contain a list of the following: 1, all categories of records released and withheld; 2, a summary of redactions made, including legal basis; 3, a list of all government officials and politically exposed persons named or referenced in the released materials, with no redactions permitted under subsection B1, though if these reports are submitted, people are going to be arguing about the redactions for years. On top of that, the Trump administration has had 9 months to monkey with the files that they have. Their report to the DOJ already spent thousands of person hours culling through the files looking for any reference to Trump. It's possible that they will improperly redact the files or outright withhold the worst documents for Trump.